Um, and then absolutely the floor is yours, ladies.
Okay, great. Good evening. I also wanted to introduce Miss Eliza Rijos, who is one of my fantastic interns for advocacy and community engagement. She is having some challenges with her sound, so she will be saying hello to everyone in the chat. So thank you, Eliza, for being with us on this evening. She is a phenomenal student at Temple University in the city of Philadelphia. So I will prepare to share my screen. I just let someone in, someone was in the waiting room. Can everyone see the screen okay? Smile if you can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this evening, we are going to do our best to articulate what is dyslexia, what is SLD, a specific learning disability, and most importantly, what is it and how can I help my child? So dyslexia, as defined by the International Dyslexia Association, is a specific learning disability. It's neurological in origin, and its difficulties are characterized by accurate and fluent reading, word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding abilities. So when you think about the prefix in the word dyslexia, there is a disconnect with language, with sounds, with auditory processing, visual processing, all of which impacts reading. Here is a picture of our left brain and our right brain, just to highlight the specific regions of the brain that have specific responsibilities. So our left side of the brain, of course, we have our math, our language, our reading, our writing, and analytical skills. The right hemisphere of our brain, this is where we have our personality traits, our intuition, music, art, creativity, and you'll oftentimes notice individuals, even though they may have dyslexia, they are oftentimes extremely talented artistically, athletically, musically. They have so many gifts in light, I won't say despite, but in light of their dyslexia. Here is a visual giving you two visuals of a brain. One side of the brain, on the left side, you have the dyslexic brain, where you see just one red dot. So we see that there's not too much activity going on. Whereas the right side of the screen, you have the non-impaired brain, and you see more red dots, which shows more activity, which is why the person who is not impaired, they have the ability to shift from one task to the next without any difficulty. An individual who is dyslexic, oftentimes they have difficulty remembering information, shifting from one task to the next, sustaining their attention, and recall, overall working memory, and oftentimes executive functioning challenges. Oftentimes you may hear teachers, parents, family members, specialists, whomever, oftentimes just because we are not as educated as we may need to be with dyslexia, oftentimes we may say, oh, he's lazy, he has poor self-esteem, or she has a short attention span, he or she is not working up to their potential, when in actuality, they are working very, very hard. Some indicators of dyslexia, oftentimes a family history, the mother, the father, the grandparents, oftentimes it is definitely passed down, it is hereditary. Children will have difficulty with organization, following a sequence of multiple spoken tasks. So we're not even talking about reading and writing right now. Mom may say, Samantha, go upstairs, brush your teeth, take your bath, take your clothes out for school tomorrow, and come downstairs and help mommy set the table for dinner. While that seems like a very simplified list of spoken tasks, oftentimes for the dyslexic, it can be extremely overwhelming. We also may hear that, oh, he's smart, she's creative, and those are, again, examples and indicators of someone who may be dyslexic. Poor comprehension, poor or inconsistent spelling, slow, belabored reading at or below their grade level, and rhyming patterns. When you think about children who are in pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, all of those books and wonderful nursery rhymes, when you see red flags of a child having some difficulties, and I'm not speaking of just, slight difficulties, because at those early levels, children are they're going to write backwards, they're going to hold the pencil backwards. Certain things are simply developmental. But when it extends beyond a certain grade level and beyond a certain age level, that is when it's cause for paying more attention to it. So these are some indicators. Spelling words with more phonetic spellings. For instance, the word laugh, if they spell the word L-A-F, they are spelling it phonetically. So while that is a strength, they understand the task, it is oftentimes definitely an indicator of someone who's dyslexic. And despite tutoring instruction, supplemental instruction, you could have a very well-seasoned teacher, evidence-based programs, and this child may still continue despite the instruction that they have, which causes a lot of frustration, not only for the child, but for the parent and for the teachers as well. And then also simply remembering previously learned information, decoded words that they read yesterday, words that they read maybe an hour ago. So when you think about that wonderful, famous spelling test that we have on Fridays, you spend all week exhausting efforts to memorize these words and how to spell them. And then the day after the test, what happens? That child may not remember how to spell the words at all. And that is definitely a red flag, because if they don't understand the context of associating letters with sounds and sound correspondences, and all of those early literacy tasks that stem from phonemic awareness and phonics to become a fluent and efficient reader, that definitely is a red flag and indicator. Some of the challenges that exist and oftentimes are comorbid with dyslexia are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism, dyscalculia, which is a math impairment, dysgraphia, which is a writing impairment, and dyspraxia, which is a developmental coordination disorder, obsessive compulsive disorders, as well as oppositional defiant disorders and Tourette's syndrome. So these are oftentimes comorbid with dyslexia. So we have to be extremely careful. Even when we see certain indicators, we have to caution ourselves not to simply just place labels on children. We have to really do the research and the screening and look at that child's medical profile, look at that child's academic profile, and all of the individuals who serve as a part of the multidisciplinary team, starting with mom, dad, the grandparents, the teachers, the specialists, the reading specialists, the speech and language pathologist, the principal, the counselor. All of those individuals play a significant part. Even the primary care physician, all of those individuals play a significant part in looking at that child's profile to ensure that we are not misrepresenting the indicators or some of the observations that we're noticing from them. Children with dyslexia are oftentimes very vulnerable to anxiety, depression, and stress. And while we know academic performance and efficiency is extremely important, the emotional symptoms, the mental wellness of a child is extremely important as well. Imagine a child who's constantly depressed or stressed out or feeling anxiety because they have to read in front of the class. Because when they read, they may stutter or they may stumble over words. That causes a lot of anxiety for children. So we have to be mindful and put resources in place and supports in place for those children as early as possible. As I mentioned, the three categories that are highlighted throughout this presentation: dyslexia is the impairment in reading, dysgraphia, the impairment in written expression, and dyscalculia, the impairment in mathematics. You'll see the reference to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Now, I will caution you that teachers, principals, reading specialists, those wonderful educators in the school system, they do not refer to that document. That is more of a clinical document that is used, but that is the formal term to reference dyslexia, the reading impairments, the writing impairments, as well as the math impairments. Dyslexia in its simplest form is simply referenced as encoding challenges, the ability to spell words, and decoding, the ability to recognize words on sight. So sometimes a child may be extremely dyslexic, but they have a phenomenal memory. That does not mean that they have mastered the skill set or the strategy of how to decode the words. They've simply seen them over and over and over again. When you think about early literacy, they have the big books, they have the nursery rhymes, they have the read alouds, and the teacher is constantly exposing the students to the print. And so they hear it, they see it, and oftentimes it's based on rote memorization, but not really truly understanding the task or the skill how to read that word. So difficult words that are phonetically irregular, such as should and enough, definitely will present a challenge for children. Dyseidetic, I'm going to share three core terms of dyslexia. And not to overwhelm you with the pronunciation of them, but dyseidetic dyslexia is simply either the person cannot or they have extreme difficulty and challenges efficiently decoding words or spelling them because they're unable to remember the words as a whole if they're irregular sight words. And so these are deficits that are outside of the language processing center of the brain. Dyseidetic, when you think of dys, the prefix dys, a dyskinetic, dys-eye, meaning visual, eye. So again, being able to recognize it on sight. Dysphonetic dyslexia, when you think of dysphonetic, phonetic, phonemic awareness, phonological awareness, phonics, that association of letters to sounds. This is where the child or the individual has challenges, or either they just cannot simply do it at all in breaking the words phonetically apart, regular words down into their smallest unit of sound, those individual parts. They're unable to sound out those unknown words. So oftentimes when a person is screened or tested for dyslexia, you definitely want to test what is referenced as pseudo words or nonsense words. They essentially mean the same thing. But if that person, if that child can read a pseudo word or a nonsense word, we truly know that they understand that task. But this is a red flag if they cannot, because it is an unknown word. And so these are considered deficits that are inside of the language processing center of the brain. Visual processing, auditory processing, the ability to associate beginning sounds, middle sounds, categorizing sounds, isolating sounds, and manipulating sounds. And then we have dysphoneidetic, and this is simply mixed dyslexia. It is a combination of a child being dyseidetic and dysphonetic at the same time. So there are different manifestations of dyslexia. We have problematic, mild, moderate, and severe. So it is extremely important when you are getting screened, getting a diagnosis, getting an identification for your child, you want to ensure, number one, that you asked the evaluator, at the conclusion of this test, will you be able to determine if my child is dyslexic? Yes or no? There's no in between. It's either yes or no. And then you also want to ask the question, what is the level of manifestation? Is it problematic, mild, moderate, or severe? Because that is going to determine the level of intensity and frequency in which that child should receive instruction and intervention. Dysgraphia, I'm going to give you two categories of dysgraphia. The first is the non-language based. So this is where the child has difficulty forming letters that are legible, ordering letters in sequence to make words that are legible, unable to stay on the line as they are writing. Their words are either too big, too jumbled, too small, or a combination of both. They're either on the line, below the line, or all over the place. And challenges with spacing in the context of their writing. Dysgraphia from the language-based process is the sound symbol. So recognizing the sounds associated with those letters. So they may very well know the letters of their alphabet, but they may be pronouncing the sounds inaccurately. And if they're not pronouncing them correctly, guess what happens when they try to read the words in isolation? Then guess what happens when they try to read the words in a phrase, in a sentence, in a paragraph? And then it just builds and builds and builds. So it's crucial the first time that you see red flags, that you think something is going on. And it doesn't mean that every child is dyslexic, but it does mean that there's cause to pay attention to it because we want to intervene as early as possible. And dysgraphia in the language-based sense also presents challenges with composing grammatically correct sentences. That may be spoken language grammatically correct as well as in writing, because oftentimes the way that we speak, it definitely shows up in our writing. So word order, sequence, transition statements, writing becomes very sophisticated as we transition from third grade to fourth grade into those higher elementary years, into the middle school and high school years. So these are also some indicators to be attentive to. Dyscalculia is the math impairment. This affects the child's ability to understand or remember or even manipulate different numbers or number facts. It is so amazing how I see so many different profiles. I literally had a young man, I believe he was in 5th or 6th grade, and he had challenges with fluency, he had challenges with his rate of reading, and he had challenges with his accuracy of reading. But guess what? He could do word problems, He could do all of these sophisticated math concepts, but when he had the math drill where he had to complete as many addition problems in 60 seconds, complete as many subtraction problems in 60 seconds, and complete as many multiplication facts in 60 seconds, he had the biggest challenge of them all. And it was just so amazing that you think someone is strong in the more challenging areas, and what we may consider to be easy, quote unquote, that is where they present with challenges. So number sense is definitely a red flag in terms of the math impairment for dyscalculia. As we transition to this next phase, this is the area where I definitely want to just spend a little bit of time because it speaks to a lot of what I just consider misinformation, misinterpretation, and just lack of understanding, to be quite honest. Number one, schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools, independent schools, and especially our public schools, they are not designed to quote unquote diagnose children with anything, to be quite honest, but specifically diagnose children with dyslexia. School systems in the United States are set up to identify if children are eligible for special education services. So in order to be eligible for special education services, a child must have a disability and they must exhibit and show that they have a need for those services. That evidence must be shown in order for the child that they're not able to make successful progress in the general education class. Something is hindering them. So we have to figure out what that is. So that is why a comprehensive evaluation, whether it's done in the school district or outside of the school district, that is why it is extremely necessary, because we have to determine, number one, is this child eligible for special education services? Now, while school systems don't quote unquote diagnose, and they may not have a quote unquote test for dyslexia, there is certainly enough information in the process of testing where they can glean that this child may exhibit characteristics of dyslexia. And certainly if you go to a specialized clinic or service provider, they may be able to give you a quote unquote diagnosis of dyslexia. So schools do not diagnose. They provide what is referenced as an educational classification, and they test to determine if a child is eligible for special education services. So I'll give you two examples. A child could qualify for special education services, but they may not be dyslexic. Another scenario is that they don't qualify for special education services and they are truly dyslexic. They might be severely dyslexic. And so there is a specific challenge in that area. We have to be very careful to ask really good quantifying, qualifying questions to ensure that whatever assessments you're getting done, ask what assessments are being administered. Ask, what the outcome is going to be so you know specifically. And if you are able to receive an official diagnosis of dyslexia for your child, you can definitely, with 100%, request to have that category written in your child's IEP as SLD, specific learning disability, dyslexia. Now, I'm going to pause right there because I have another slide that I'm going to share with you. What I'm sharing with you right now, and I will tell you with so much passion and so much frustration at the same time, many parents don't know this. Many educators don't know this. Many school districts do not have this information. I constantly have conversations on a day-to-day basis with families and parents, and they want to know, well, how come, Dr. Campbell, how come the school didn't write this in the child's IEP? Or how come they're not calling it dyslexia? It's simply because they may not have been informed. So I am going to share some information with you in this presentation. I have a link that is on my website. I have a video from Michael Uden, who is with the United States Department of Education, Special Education Rehabilitative Services, and I have the letter that was written that you are more than welcome to download from my website, and it is proof that you can have this written into your child's IEP if they are dyslexic, if they are dysgraphic, or if they have dyscalculia. So it's extremely important that you just be mindful of this dear colleague letter. That is what it's referenced as. And it basically states there is no reason why those terms cannot be identified in the IEP paperwork. And so someone may ask, well, is it really necessary if I put it in there? If they're getting push-in or if they're getting pull-out or if they're getting RTI, do I really have to put it in there? I'll be quite honest with you. Absolutely. We have to call it what it is. Oftentimes, I look at IEPs and many parents may see in their child's IEP, it may say SLD, specific learning disability, but it may not reference dyslexia. So when you think of a specific learning disability, parents want to know, well, what is it? What does that mean? It could mean a reading impairment. It could be a written expression impairment. It could be issues with math, challenges with math. It can mean a lot of things. So as the parent or the family member or the caregiver, you want to ensure that your child's IEP is as specific and as explicit as it needs to be to ensure that we have measurable and observable goals that are progress monitored throughout that child's process. So here is the link at the bottom of the screen. And again, this link will take you to my website. I'll have my website at the end of the slides. You will see the video with Michael Uden talking with a representative from the International Learning Disabilities Association, as well as the actual 4-page letter that goes into detail. And the reason that this letter was written, it was because there was so much pushback as parents were trying to figure out from the school counselor, the principal, the multidisciplinary team, the school psychologist, what's going on with my child? How come I can't get services? How come the dyslexia is not being addressed? That was the rationale for this letter being written.
I wanted to share a little fact. I actually provided the letter during a meeting in the school district of Philadelphia, and I shared the video and told them exactly where to go in the video, noting
Awesome.
that we can embed, they still can do it.
Wow.
Oh, it's amazing.
With the letter in the video.
It's amazing. There's a lot of
that was
pushback. There's a
lady
lot of
letter.
pushback.
No, there shouldn't be,
Yes.
but it's
So
it was
advocacy is so
letter.
important. Yeah. And that's why I always share with parents and families, you know, you are your child's best advocate. If you have an advocate to speak on your behalf, definitely try to secure one. And if you don't, try to learn as much as you can, whether it's dyslexia, autism, attention deficit disorder, no matter what it is, try to learn as much as you possibly can to ensure that your child's civil rights are being met as they should be. And with your child's IEP, if your child has an IEP, and even if they don't have an IEP currently, if you think that your child is dyslexic or has any other challenges, the purpose of the IEP, it's a legal document to ensure that the proper instruction is provided to your child. The regular classroom, as we know, is set up with whole group instruction. We're teaching to the masses. There may be some small group instruction going on, but certain children can benefit from more action that is more customized and one-on-one. And so that is when we come in contact with the need to address accommodations and specific modifications. So sometimes there's a little confusion between the two. Accommodations actually change how a student learns the material. So there may be adjustments with time, extended time, allowing that child to have extended wait time and think time, because some children have processing challenges, not because they're not smart, not because they're not intelligent, but simply because they need adequate time to process the information. An accommodation could be providing less spelling words on a spelling list. It could be less amounts of homework. It could be the seating arrangement. It could be the size of the text or the font. So those are just some very quick examples, but realistic examples that can be written into your child's IEP. Modifications actually change what the child or what the student is taught and what they are expected to learn. So it could be a child who's receiving changes to the curriculum. They may be in 6th grade, but they may have not mastered all of the skills necessary and the prerequisite skills to even function on that grade level. So they have to work on skills from a previous grade level. They may be assigned an easier reading leveled reader compared to what the rest of their classmates are getting. So those are examples of accommodations and modifications. I have a few examples that I wanted to share based on some of the questions that were presented to me. Here is a sample of an IEP goal. Now, I will share with you one of my biggest frustrations is looking at IEPs, and I'm sure, you know, as Bonitas and some of the parents may also have this same frustration. When you look at an IEP and you see so many goals, or you don't see enough goals, or you're not clear what the goal is supposed to do or what it's supposed to mean. Goals are supposed to be measurable, they're supposed to be achievable, they're supposed to be realistic, and they're supposed to be observable. So a lot of times when we look at these documents, sometimes it can be overwhelming because it just seems like a lot of jargon. So here's just a very simplified example of an appropriate goal. By the end of the school year, so I'm stating when this is going to happen. There's no question. I'm not just leaving it loose I'm just saying at the end of the school year, this particular student will read grade level text. So I'm being very specific. I'm not just saying a passage, I'm stating the grade level. They may be a 4th grade student, an 8th grade student. They will read the grade level text orally with accuracy, appropriate rate, and expression at 90 words per minute. So I'm stating how many words with 90% accuracy. I'm also stating the percentage of accuracy as measured, because I can't just list these goals. I have to state, how is it going to be measured? It has to be measured by teacher data or the teacher's records. And it has to be measured with some consistency, 3 consecutive occasions. Because one of the challenges with anyone who has learning challenges, especially dyslexia, they have a lot of inconsistencies. They may get it today and not get it tomorrow. They might get it right now at 7:37 p.m. and not get it at 7:40 p.m. So you want to have 3 consecutive occasions. And again, this is just a very basic example, but this is an appropriate example of an IEP goal. And what I want you to keep in mind is that student needs drive goals. So it's important that you understand your child's needs. What is he or she struggling with? Because whatever their needs are, that's what those goals need to speak to. So the next few examples that I've shared with you are going to speak to the student's needs. So this is just a generic example. I have my little fictitious student here, Zaire, who's in the 4th grade. He was assessed for special education. His scores are low in decoding, fluency, and reading comprehension. However, Zaire has high average to above average scores in listening comprehension, math, and writing skills. And this is a perfect example of a profile of a child who is dyslexic. The listening comprehension is good because they have good listening skills, but their reading comprehension is not as strong as their listening comprehension because they're struggling with decoding and fluency. And so Zaire needs at least 3, if not 4. He definitely needs the 3 because we can see decoding, fluency, and comprehension as his low scores. But the 4th goal could also be phonemic awareness, because phonemic awareness instruction comes before phonics, comes before decoding. Phonemic awareness examples would include isolating sounds, middle sounds or medial sounds, categorizing sounds. I might say the words run, rat, rabbit. What is the beginning sound that all of those words have in common? The letter R and the R sound. Blending sounds, blending them together. B, g, bug. So blending, isolation, all of those are just quick examples of phonemic awareness tasks. So if I have challenges in decoding, more than likely I'm going to have some deficits and challenges with phonemic awareness. So that could potentially be a 4th goal if we needed to add another one. And just to even add another goal, we may even need to add a spelling goal, because decoding is reading the words, but spelling is encoding the words. So if I'm a student who has challenges with phonemic awareness and phonics and decoding, more than likely, I'm going to have some challenges with spelling. Unfortunately, dyslexic children and adults, they have challenges with spelling. So those are just some ideas that we need to just keep in mind. And before I leave this slide, I just wanted to preface, goals must be separate. They must be separate. We can't lump them all together. The decoding goal needs to speak to what Zaire, Samantha, Jessica, Tommy, what their specific instruction is going to look like and what they're expected to do by the end of the school year, by the end of the report card period, whatever time frame it is, it has to be specific. It can't be lumped together, and it has to be measurable. So these next examples I provided based on Zaire's profile. This first example for decoding is very vague. Zaire will be able to decode a list of 10 words with medial vowel sounds with 80% accuracy. Well, first of all, a list of 10 words, what are the 10 words? Are they grade level words? Are they vocabulary words? Are they spelling words? With the medial sound, but we already know he has trouble with decoding overall. So the medial sound is just one particular skill set. He needs instruction in all of them. So a more appropriate goal will be what I have listed below. Zaire will be able to decode a list of 50, not 10, because 10 is not really enough. It doesn't present a challenge. It's not as aggressive as enough as it needs to be for his grade level. And now I'm also specifically stating that they are 4th grade words because that is the grade that he's in. So we need to make sure that the grade is in conjunction and in line with what grade that particular student is in. And now I'm giving a variation of different exercises, tasks that Zaire will be able to, he will have to master. 10 consonant, vowel, consonant words, consonant vowel, and 20 vowel consonant silent E words, and 10 vowel consonant words with 80% accuracy. In some instances, it might be 90% accuracy, but we want it to be aggressive enough and challenging, but at the same time, we need it to be realistic. So we can't say with 100% accuracy because that may not be realistic for your particular child or for your particular student. An example for fluency, a vague goal would be Zaire will read an appropriate text at 90 correct words per minute with 80% accuracy in 3 out of 4 trials as measured by teacher data. Now, when we break this down, when we really think about it, read an appropriate text. Well, I don't even know what grade level it is. In the profile, we know that Zaire is in 4th grade, so his goal needs to specifically state that it's a 4th grade text. And in terms of accuracy, we're saying read the text at 90 correct words per minute with 80% accuracy. Well, when you do the math of that, that really comes out to 72. So we have to ensure that the numbers in the math make sense, make it make sense in terms of, you know, those 3 out of 4 trials as measured by teacher data. So a more appropriate goal would be Zaire will read an unfamiliar. And when this is very important because we have what is referenced as a cold read or a hot read. A cold read means that the child has never seen it before. A hot read, they've seen it before, they're familiar with it. And when we know these kiddos have, you know, phenomenal rote memory, they'll memorize it because they've seen it and heard it several times. We will truly know if they understand the task and have mastered it, if it's unfamiliar and they can read it with automaticity. So the word unfamiliar is really being specific. 4th grade text is being specific. 90 words, correct words per minute, 3 out of 4 trials as measured by teacher data or teacher records is a more appropriate way to write a goal. And my final example for reading, because we know reading comprehension was one of Zaire's challenges. The vague goal would state, Zaire will read a grade appropriate passage and be able to identify the main idea and 3 supporting details with 70% accuracy. Well, here we go again with that grade appropriate passage. Well, what is the kiddo's grade? We must be very specific in stating what his grade level is. And 70% accuracy, that's not really challenging him. That's not really aggressive enough. We still, even though we know the child is struggling, we still want to set high expectations for them. So an appropriate goal would state, Zaire will read a 4th grade nonfiction passage. It may be fiction, it may be nonfiction, but whatever it is, we have to state the type of genre that Zaire is expected to read along with his grade level. Remember in the profile, I stated that Zaire had really high scores with listening comprehension. We already know he has deficits, so we don't want to lose sight of the strengths that he has. So we want to give him audio book support because that is his strength. So we're going to couple that with his reading support. And Zaire will be able to identify the main idea and 3 supporting details. So we are stating specifically what he's expected to do. And because it has to be measurable and observable, we're going to state with 90% accuracy in 3 out of 4 trials as documented by teacher data. So again, we want to make sure that the goals are measurable, they're observable, they're realistic, and also, even more importantly, setting high expectations, but making sure that they're achievable. So this is why parent input, caregiver input, everyone on that multidisciplinary team is extremely important. You have the right as the parent, even if you sign on that IEP tomorrow morning, a month later, 2 days later, 24 hours later, if there is something that you do not agree with in that IEP, or if something else has been brought to your attention, and you decide, oh, I think I need to have that implemented in my child's IEP. As the parent, you have the right to make that known to the multidisciplinary team. You can make adjustments, modifications to your child's IEP at any given time. And guess what? Many parents don't know that they have that right. So again, your parental rights are extremely important in knowing what you have access to and knowing what you're able to do. I also wanted to share the difference between research-based and evidence-based intervention. Oftentimes, these terms are used interchangeably. And in some instances, you know, it makes sense, but to be very specific, research-based may be just specifically a part of a program or part of a method. It may not be the entire method, and it may not be the entire program. In some cases, it could be. So this is why we definitely want to do our research when we're working with instructional programs. Even if you're going to the doctor and the doctor wants to try a new medication on you, make sure that it's an evidence-based and research-based type of medication. Orton-Gillingham is an example of a method or an approach that has been research-based. And because the Orton-Gillingham approach method has been research-based, it is oftentimes integrated in evidence-based intervention programs. So that's why sometimes you may hear the terms used interchangeably. But with that being said, I would still do my research. If you're concerned about what program best meets your child's needs, have that conversation with the school team. Ask them, well, what kind of intervention programs do you use with my child? Based on his or her learning style, I've learned that the ABC program might be a better fit for my child. You have that right as the parent to make that determination and have that conversation. And evidence-based intervention programs are typically based on some type of trial study where there's a control group, and they're basically reporting on the effectiveness of the A program versus the B program. So when you think of evidence-based, you're thinking of structured literacy where you have phonemic awareness, where you have phonics, where you have morphology, where you have syntax. Does it sound right? Does it look right? Is it grammatically correct? Where you have semantics, does it make sense? You know, all of those different elements make up the umbrella of structured literacy. So the Orton-Gillingham method and structured literacy practices, those are both practices that are oftentimes recommended for any child that has any type of reading or language-based learning deficit, but especially dyslexia. And on this particular slide, I have listed a variety of different programs. Now, some of these programs may be in your child's school, some of them may not be in your child's school. When you're meeting with the IEP team or the multidisciplinary team, you may be informing them of certain programs, and this may offer the possibility to have your child work in one of these programs. Schools get all sorts of funding, so it may be an opportunity for the school to use funding to bring some of these programs into your child's school. So we have everything from the alphabet phonics, the Barton reading and spelling system, corrective reading, the LeBach way to reading. That is an excellent program for children, especially middle school and high school students who may have cognitive deficits, other developmental delays, the Wilson reading system, which is a very popular system, phonographics, but all of these programs have structured literacy, Orton-Gillingham based methods and approaches embedded in them. So when you think about those critical elements of literacy that a child needs to be exposed to ensure that they become a proficient reader, we know that we need phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, decoding, spelling, oral language, reading comprehension, written expression. We need all of that, syntax and semantics as well, as just a few examples. This next slide, I've put together a list of parent resources. These are some of my favorite reads. Overcoming Dyslexia, the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan, the Everything Parents Guide to Children with Dyslexia. And I won't read them all, but just highlighting a few of them. Dyslexia Help Book for Parents, the Help Handbook for Parents. So this information will be available to you. I will say the very last reference on the screen, Wright's Law, all about IEPs. I highly recommend all of them, but Wright's Law on the next slide that I'm going to share also has a website link, and it is definitely worth perusing to become more familiar with what your rights are as a parent as you help to develop and ensure that your child's IEP is in line with his or her learning needs. And these references are taking you to different websites, CHAD for attention deficit disorder, resources, programs, just support systems, the International Dyslexia Association, understood.org. They have all sorts of videos, articles, everything that you can possibly imagine just to help inform you and educate you with the different resources to help you make sure that your child gets the type of services that he or she may benefit from. So at this time, I am going to switch gears over to my sister, Dr. Tracy Johnson-Rockmore, and she is going to share the social and emotional side of dyslexia. Dr. Rockmore?
I almost forgot I was presenting. I just love listening to my sister all the time, and I always learn, no matter when she speaks, I always learn so much all the time, and I just appreciate that knowledge because it's really helpful to all of us. So if we could progress to the next slide, that would be great. So I'm just going to share with you about the social and emotional impact of dyslexia. I don't know if I share in my introduction, I am dyslexia dyslexic myself. I was not identified until I was out of high school. So I struggled with a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today as a child myself. So individuals with dyslexia, they report being angry, stressed, embarrassed, ashamed. You see that aggression, that guilt, that isolation, insecurity, that anxiety, that which Dr. Campbell spoke about, low motivation, low self-esteem, and related social problems. So a lot of these things, what we don't want is for our children to develop these issues. So we try to really address the emotional part along with the academic side of dealing with dyslexia, because it is an emotional component that goes along with that. And as a child develops dealing with these challenges, these things will heighten definitely the depression, the low self-esteem, the not feeling worthy to be a part of their classmates or being part of a group. All those things begin to develop. So adolescents with learning disabilities, of course, including dyslexia, they often, they're twice at risk for that emotional and that social distress. They also are at risk of violence and suicide attempts, which I was a product of that. I had suicide attempts when I was a child because of the struggles of dealing with dyslexia. These things will manifest, but that's why we're here to support and get this information out there, how that these social and emotional impact of dyslexia can couple, which not just, I always say dyslexia is not just an academic issue. It affects everything that we deal with in life. So also the memories, this can actually damage a child all throughout up until adulthood. There's many adults that actually going to go through a little bit about the prison to pipeline, because there's many adults, because of their dyslexia, they developed all these issues that could have range from being on drugs to being incarcerated and all kinds of other violent issues. They drop out early, those types of things, because of the frustration they dealt with in school. They just could not take that anxiety and that depression in school. Next slide, please. Students with learning disabilities, of course, including dyslexia, they're labeled as being disruptive in the class. So oftentimes you'll hear that possibly with males, they may act out a little bit more because it's avoidance. They use it as avoidance. That pop reading. That's the worst thing you can do for a dyslexic student, that pop reading in school. Okay, you read the next paragraph, Johnny, you read this, No, for a dyslexic, that anxiety will heighten to the max. You will see them either make an excuse, disrupt your class, they will act out, try to be either the class clown or something like that. Often with young girls, such as myself, I was more quiet, I was good. I was trying to really disappear. So you try to avoid being called on. You did not want to exist. Or you make excuse, going to the bathroom frequently during reading times, those type of things. That's not really disrupting with girls, they try to avoid. And some boys, they will avoid by disrupting the class sometimes. This can negatively, of course, impact the child because they're going to be missing a lot of class time because they're trying to escape reading. They're trying to escape that task. So they're going to miss a lot of information, important information that they need because they're trying to escape that reading task. The increase of likelihood of the student with dyslexia will being retained in their grade or being dropped out. They're often placed in the juvenile justice systems. Of course, that's leading back to the prison, the pipeline ladder that we talked about. Next slide. Students with dyslexia, again, we talked about they're overrepresented in the prison and system, which they are. There's the high statistics already talks about a lot of people that are incarcerated. Oftentimes they struggle with some type of learning disability, undiagnosed learning disability, or possibly diagnosed learning disability. That's a high population in the prison systems. The child, again, is frustrated with, and they're irritable. They're trying to meet the expectations of their teacher. They're trying to meet the expectations of their parent. So they are bright. You often hear she or she is so bright. She or she is so, they're so articulate. I used to hear that, oh, you speak well. How possibly could you be dyslexic? That does not impair the way I speak. Or I used to hear a lot, you don't look dyslexic. How am I supposed to look? So again, it's not a look to dyslexia. Again, the child is bright, the individual is bright, but oftentimes with us, it's hard to access what we know in a written format or sometimes in a verbal format. Okay. Oftentimes you will hear again, the child, speaking about anxiety dealing with dyslexia. Symptoms of anxiety, it heightens definitely when an individual with dyslexia is nervous. They'll start to jumble their words really quickly or something like that. That nervous anxiety will just really come up when they're presented with a task that's often unfamiliar to them if they have to read right in front of somebody. That brings the frustration, the confusion, all those type things, especially when a child becomes into those adolescent years, because that's when they wanted to fit in with their peers and things like that, and things that their peers are doing, it gets frustrated to them because they're not fitting in those tasks as far as, getting that perfect A on that spelling test or preparing for their SATs. They're excited. So most students are excited about those things. Some students with dyslexia, they're going to be struggling with those areas. All right, our next slide. Okay. Also with the anxiety, because many they anticipate failure. A lot of times with people with dyslexia, we actually have an internal dialogue. So we even start to talk about, oh, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do that. We start to anticipate, and that anxiety, that anxiousness, and promotes that anxiety, heightens, because even sometimes you are encouraging your child, you can do this, you're bright, you're that, but that internal dialogue we have to help them to change that. Because sometimes we begin that self-fulfilling prophecy where we start to speak, oh, I can't do this, I'm not good at that, reading is bad, that's bad. All that, it begins to play out because we don't have that confidence within ourselves. Many teachers and parents, anger. Again, that emotion of anger, a lot of times in dealing with dyslexia, most that anger comes and that frustration comes from school oftentimes, because just imagine you're going to your job every day and you're dealing with something that's so hard from 9 to 5. Your child is going into that school every day dealing with something that they're confronted as so hard from the time they come in to the time they leave. So all that frustration and anger is built up there. They don't sometimes want to release that in school. So sometimes that frustration will be released at home. So oftentimes the parent is the target. They're upset, not at you, but they're upset at the situations that they had to deal with at school. So now they feel like they're in a safe place where they can release that anger. But again, the parents like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to help so hard. I'm trying to support them so much. Why they're so angry? But again, that frustration is at school. They just need a safe place to come sometimes to release that. And sometimes they may need they may need some other type of support, like a psychologist or some type of therapy to help release that anger, because they don't know how to access really to release that in a proper way. So also, again, the child, as adolescents, really that they wanted to go into that independence. So that's a hard place, because adolescent period, again, we all know we want to state our independence. But students with dyslexia, it's hard to do that, because again, they need still that support, but yet they want to try to still, just like any other child, I want to do this on my own. But those challenges are always going to be there. So it's going to be sometimes that conflict between you and that adolescent child. Adolescence is a hard period anyway. So coupling that with dyslexia, it's even harder to make that transition because they still need that support, but they want to still try to get their independence in somehow. So it's going to be creating sometimes that conflict between the parent and the child. Dyslexic self-image is very important. A lot of times, a dyslexic self-image is very vulnerable because, again, it's not only the way that they feel like others are looking at them, but also the way they're looking at themselves. So that self-image is very important. We have to find some ways, like even what Dr. Campbell stating is, we always state, like we also need to support what they're good at, because that's going to build that self-confidence and that self-image of themselves, that at least I'm good over here. I can flourish over here. I'm a star at, I don't know, baseball, basketball, whatever the task, whatever their gift is, making sure we allow them space to can kind of maximize that, because again, we want to build that self-image. Okay, next slide. Again, going into, feeling that power of, they're sometimes trying to protect. Oftentimes, I don't know about all people, but a lot of times students with dyslexia, I'm speaking of myself, we're trying to mask all the time. You're always trying to cover up. You're trying to protect because you don't want anybody to know you're vulnerable in that area where you can't spell or you can't read. So it's always you're masking. We always sometimes have to feel like we have a guard or armor on because you're trying to protect that vulnerability, because you know I'm going to be discovered that I can't read. I'm going to be discovered I can't spell or something like that. So we're constantly putting on a mask. So to feel that we feel powerless, honestly, in those areas. So to help that self-image in those areas, again, making sure that the student gets what they need as far as the academic support, making sure they get that Orton Gillingham, whatever program that works for them. Because I know personally, once a student goes through a program like that and builds up that confidence and those skills in an area where they're weak, they feel more empowered. They feel more confident. They gain that self-worth where I can do this. I know I struggle. It may take me a little bit longer, but I can do it. So we have to find ways to really build up that self-esteem and that self-worth. Next slide. Depression, it also couples with a student with dealing with the learning disability. Oftentimes that depression is going to come where they have those challenges where they're not maximizing not being able to do what they need to do in school, as far as with those failed grade or that failed test and all this. Like I know with myself, it's like, oh, this is just another incident. They told me I couldn't do this. They told me I couldn't do this. So all that's going to breed on that depression, and that depression goes into the low self-esteem. That depression also can go into other things like drug addiction. That depression can go into all types of other types of behavior. So you just kind of have to watch, like what causes, what issue, what triggered that? Did something happen in school? Did someone say something? Did something occur where you felt bad about yourself that you did something wrong? So you kind of want to find out where that's coming from. Again, if it gets to a level where it's too kind of overbearing for the child, definitely seek get them some help, get them the right support that they need socially or emotionally with some type of therapist. Because again, we want to build that foundation where they feel like they're confident in who they are as a person. I always say dyslexia does not define an individual. Dyslexia does not define who the child is. It's just a way, it's just another way that they have to comprehend and they learn, but it doesn't define who you are as an individual. So again, the depressed child is unlikely to talk about his sad feelings. So they may not know how to express that. They may not, so maybe they can draw something. that the outlets may not go, it's not always going to be in us writing, because it was so funny. Because I was told, oh, journalist or journalist. A dyslexic child is not going to journal. So you may want to look at another way that they can express how they're feeling. It could be with clay. It could be with art. It could be with music. Some other way that they can express how they're feeling without bringing in the very thing that they dread, and that is spelling and writing. So even verbal, they can verbalize it, I don't know, to a stuffed animal or something, if they don't want to talk to a person. Just some way to get those negative emotions out. Family problems in dealing with dyslexic. Oftentimes, it could come out in a variety of ways. Civil rivalry, putting more attention on the dyslexic child than the non-dyslexic child, they feel like the parents are giving them more attention because they're struggling. But oftentimes the dyslexic child really does not want that much attention. So they just want to kind of be like their other siblings, but oftentimes it can bring that conflict within the family, because again, that child needs more attention. That child needs, more attention in getting services, more attention in getting homework help, or whatever that is. So, and sometimes also we know dyslexia does run in families. So that could be a parent themselves seeing in the mirror how they struggled as a child. So sometimes that can bring in another internal struggle within the family, because that parent now sees, that was me as a child, and I don't know how to deal with this, or let my wife or my husband deal with this, because I can't deal with that, because it's bringing up more emotions with them. So also, again, we talked about the terrifying emotions with adults, meaning, that parenting skill and things like that. Again, it just brings up that anxiety for that particular parent who could be dyslexic undiagnosed. All right. And this is information where we've received the slides, and the last slide is myself and Dr. Campbell's information, our contact information, our websites, as well as our organization, and a copy of the book for adults with dyslexia.
Ladies, I have to tell you, this was amazing, powerful. It was full of so much wonderful information. We have lots of questions. A couple of things I wanted to say. Under the DSM-5, specific learning disability does fall under the DSM-5, but dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, those things do fall under specific learning disability, and there's nothing stopping a school from being able to pepper that information throughout the report. The more information we know about the child, the better we can support the child. The difference between specific learning disability, which is a struggling reader, and dyslexia is really about programming, right? So we want to make sure that we get the appropriate programming. I wanted to ask a question. I'm not going to be able to say it right. Dysphonetic dyslexia, Dysphoneid.
Yes.
Is that also orthographic processing disorder? By chance?
It shows that it definitely shows up differently in each child. So it depends on what their profile looks like, because some children just have a lot of mixed deficits and challenges going on, but I have seen it shown up in several children's and adults profiles at the same time. Yes.
Okay. You had brought up about like handwriting, readable letters above the line, below the line, maybe too big or whatever. Would that also fall under BMI? And one of the big things I look for, I'll tell parents, I'm like, well, how's your child reading? Okay, so it's really labor intensive because their fluency is really low. I usually will also recommend that they get the vision check, not for 20/20, but I want to make sure that the eyes are teaming and converging appropriately, right? Because that could also
absolutely.
Okay. And then
and I will tell you, that is actually one of the tests that I use in my profile, the Berry. They have two components. They have the visual perception and they have the visual motor integration. There are certain tests, and everybody uses different tests, but some tests are just the gold standard of the profile if you're testing a child or an adult for dyslexia. So visual perception, visual motor integration, the GORT-5 focuses on oral reading fluency, the CTOP2, the comprehensive test of phonological processing. Those are just some quick examples of whoever is assessing a child for dyslexia. Those tests definitely need to be within that profile.
Amazing. You had mentioned Wright's Law, and I love Wright's Law. Pete and Pam Wright, they're located in Virginia. So when you go on Wright's Law, you got to keep in mind that's based upon Virginia, right? Not necessarily Pennsylvania. So you have to look at the regulations, and where IDEA is quiet, you got to look at the Pennsylvania back to see where they are with that. The other thing I've shared, my daughter, we went head to head when she was in high school because she didn't want to do ESY. And I went, I don't care, girl, you're doing it. Right? Remediation is expensive. And unless you've got the bucks to put out, we're talking $80 plus per hour, right? To get a child remediated, it is best to try to advocate to get what your child needs in school because it is their responsibility. Don't look at grades in a report card. I give no weight to grades. I look at benchmarks. Benchmarks give me a lot of information, and much like the assessments that you were talking about, the pseudo, that's a big piece, right? Because you might tell me sight words are great. I'm like, well, that's great. Tell me about the pseudo words, right? Because that'll really tell me if they're able to apply that, those rules, right, for phonetics. God, and that's all I wrote, which is great. We do have some questions in the chat. And because I had asked people, so question, are there different types of dyslexia, which you did cover, and how would you know, and what types are there? Do you have to have decoding and encoding challenges to qualify under the DSM-5? I'm assuming for dyslexia. I've always said decoding, encoding pretty much are the hallmarks of dyslexia, right? But there could be other things too, right? Reading comprehension, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Do you know what I mean? Those are also areas.
Fluency. Yes.
Yes.
And I'll give you one quick example to add on to a response to that question. So I mentioned one of the tests, the GORT-5, it's the Grade Oral Reading Fluency Assessment. That specific assessment, we are looking at assessing the child's accuracy, their rate of reading, their fluency, and their reading comprehension. I have had children and even adults across the board, across the grade levels and age ranges, that their reading comprehension is phenomenal. But when you look at the reading fluency and the oral reading fluency and their rate of reading and their accuracy, it is 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 grade levels below. But the reason the reading comprehension is so high is because they're able to pick and pull out certain words in context. And because they have analytical skills, because they have common sense and good reasoning skills, oftentimes they're able to put it together to make sense of it. So that's why you really have to get a comprehensive profile to determine what's going on, because scores can be all over the place. They can be high when we expect them to be low. They can be a mismatch. You know, I've just seen so many different profiles. And yes, there are different variations and indicators of someone who is dyslexic. As I mentioned in the profile with Zaire, he had high listening and very strong listening comprehension skills, but his decoding and fluency and reading comprehension were not as high. He scored low.
Right. And I've also heard, I've been told, again, I'm not an expert, just an advocate, parent, right? I've been told that you want to make sure that your reading level, like you were saying, like you need to know, like he's going to read on level or age appropriate. Well, what does that mean, right? What's his baseline? What grade level is he on, right? But you want to make sure that what he's reading is pretty close to his comprehension, because you don't want the comprehension to skyrocket, right? But the reading to kind of stay stagnant. And then how do you do that?
Yes.
You just continually work on reading fluency on cold reads. I'm not like a big fan of hot reads. I like cold reads, more accurate for me.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's extremely, and this was one of the questions that you had presented to me, the progress monitoring. So we're talking about these goals and how to craft the goals and making sure they're measurable, observable, the benchmarks. When all of that is in place, you know, what programs are being used, what type of instruction, is it the Orton-Gillingham method, you know, whose method is being used, what approach is being used, and the progress monitoring is essential. When you look at your child's IEP, there's a section of the IEP that talks about the frequency, the duration from, you know, November 22nd, 2022 to November 20th, 2023. And all in between, progress monitoring can take place and notify the parent on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a bi-weekly basis, each report card period, by telephone, by Zoom, by letter, by progress report. There's so many variations. And as the parent or the family or the caregiver, you want to ensure that you use every method possible to ensure that that progress monitoring is, brought to your attention. So often I've heard parents say, well, I didn't know until the month before school, before summertime, that my child might be retained or that they're failing. How come we didn't know this all along? So that progress monitoring is extremely important because it's going to determine, can we accelerate instruction? Do we need to take a few steps back? Has my child met mastery in certain aspects of the lesson versus other areas that need more remediation and need more time? So the frequency, the duration, and just overall progress monitoring is extremely important.
Yeah, and you can write goals and objectives for an evidence-based intervention. I've gone into meetings where schools are like, we don't do that. And I'm like, no, you're using an evidence-based intervention. We should have goals and objectives. And, I encourage parents, ask for the scope and sequence of the program, right? And that's what your goal should follow, is the scope and sequence, right? You want more definitive information as far as how your child is doing. I always ask for the placement tests and the post tests. That gives me an idea of the rate of acquisition for the child.
Exactly.
So, this is like good stuff, let me tell you. The other part of that question was, our children have several traits of dyslexia, and it sounds like you're describing them, ASD and ADHD, and the younger sibling also has apraxia of speech. What should we expect, or how can we help our boys?
That is a loaded question that deserves a lot of love, care, and TLC. And we need the multidisciplinary team. We need the primary care physician. We need everybody to be on board, because in order to address that child's profile collectively and comprehensively, we need to figure out, okay, what are the starting points? What are we dealing with? What are the present levels of performance? What's the medical history? What's the diagnosis, the identification? We have to look at all of that and take it one step at a time and break every element down, because even though we know these children may have deficits and challenges, number one, we can't do everything all at once. So, and when I spoke about those realistic goals, it has to be realistic and it has to be achievable. We can't achieve everything in 2 weeks or in a month, or even it might not be achieved in one entire school year. This may have to take place over the course of a school year and another school year. So it just really depends. But those conversations definitely need to start. If there's a lot going on with attention deficit disorder, autism, apraxia, all of those different challenges, we really need to speak with each of those individual specialists. And I'll give you a quick example. I spoke with a parent today and she shared some background about her child. And from what she told me, her child definitely could be a candidate for dyslexia. But because of what she shared with me, having her child fall and hit her head a few years ago, I definitely recommended, and she talked about memory loss and just a lot of things with memory. I highly suggested that she see a neurologist. And she told me that she literally was thinking about, was that the right or wrong thing to do? And I said, no, absolutely. Because even before coming to me or another specialist, it's important that you rule certain things out, or definitely pinpoint if that is the issue before you start putting other labels and doing a lot of other testing. Take one step at a time. And while it might seem like a very belabored process, a long, tedious process, guess what? It is, and it needs to be, because you need to take your time. It's important that you understand what the specialists are telling you. This is a lot, not even just the child is experiencing academic challenges, but imagine the child's frustration, the emotions that Dr. Rockmore talked about, the anxiety, the depression. Imagine the parent who's dealing with possibly feelings of guilt and shame. Did I bring this on my child because I carried the child? Is it in my bloodline? There's so many emotions that you're dealing with. So you have to process just dealing with the emotions of it all and just accepting, digesting, and just having the self-care for yourself as the parent. You have to really focus on self-care and managing this, because it's not just the academic piece, it's the holistic piece, and taking care of yourself and taking care of your child at the same time.
Oh, amen.
Yes.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you're right, it is laborsome. You have to rule out that medical first, right? To see that medical component before you can really get into the educational component. Now the next question, it's kind of double. Who would diagnose dysgraphia? Neuropsychologist, occupational therapist, and how is this different from fine motor handwriting challenges?
So that is a wonderful question. question, a very important question that everybody gets confused. So depending on the specialist background, it may be a psychologist, it may be a school psychologist, it may be a clinical psychologist, it may be a reading specialist, it may be an occupational therapist, it may be an educational diagnostician. It depends on the training that the individual has. And I'll give you a perfect example. I am not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a psychologist at all. I am an educational diagnostician. And I presented dyslexia along with some other learning disabilities at AI DuPont Hospital to psychologists. So while they were aware of what dyslexia is, they don't test for it, they don't screen for it. This was a session to help them understand the behaviors, the indicators, what resources are available so that when they talk to parents, they can share that information out. But they don't quote unquote test, assess, screen, or diagnose. So because of the training that I have, that is what equips me with the ability to test, to screen, my background in test and measurements, dyslexia, and all of those different areas. So this is why it's important when you're talking to the individuals at the school on a multidisciplinary team, different clinic providers, different service providers, ask the questions, what type of training do you have? Are you qualified to administer these tests? Are you qualified to interpret the tests? Do you understand the data, the qualitative information, the test and measurements types of information? So some of those individuals may very well be able to screen and test and diagnose and identify, but again, you definitely want to ask that question up front. And it does not have to be a reading specialist or a psychologist to diagnose necessarily any of those different areas. It's just based on their training, their level of licenses, and level of certification.
That's helpful. What diagnoses are included in specific learning disabilities? Like I know there's dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyslexia, right? What are the other ones?
Yes. So there are like 14 different categories. So there is autism, there's I just had a brain.
ADHD.
There's autism, there's dyslexia,
ADHD.
dysgraphia,
Yeah.
ADHD. Yes, and I'll say this, there used to be 13, but there are now 14. So if you Google it, you will see all of it. Deaf and blindness, you have all developmental disabilities. Those are just a few of them, but there are 14 total. And so any one of the 14, or possibly more than one, depending on the child, that may be what needs to be identified specifically in the child's IEP.
And that's why I think it's so confusing with parents when they do get that diagnosis of a specific learning disability. They like, well, again, I've heard a lot of times, well, it didn't say dyslexia. That's why, Dr. Gamble mentioned, we have to really pinpoint and really get them to pinpoint exactly what the diagnosis is. So you don't want to have it just that specific learning. Because again, a lot of students are diagnosed with that, and it still leaves the parent at a miss. Like, what is my child dealing with? I don't know how to help this child. I don't know what resources I don't know what interventions they're going to need, because it's not really stating what the issue is.
Right. Another question is, are there specific things or assessments that are key in evaluating for any of the SLDs that you mentioned tonight? And I know that you mentioned the GORD-5, is one. And I know there's another, I think you put some in your PowerPoint as well, correct?
Yes. Also, the Wyatt. Now, I'll mention a few that are usually the standard, whether it's done in school or whether it's done at a private clinic. The Wyatt 4. So the Wyatt is the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. Now, I'll give you a quick example. During the pandemic, the company changed, the Pearson changed the copyright. So at that time, it was the Wyatt 3. And so while I was administering assessments, the Wyatt 4 came out, and I started using the Wyatt 4, but some schools and some private settings were still using the Wyatt 3. The difference between the Wyatt 3 and the Wyatt 4 is that the Wyatt 4 has a dyslexia indicator. So it gives a lot more information in terms of if that child may be considered, as having dyslexia, how they screen in terms of their decoding, their encoding, and their fluency. So the Wyatt 4, the WISC-5, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, ages 6 through 16. So while that is an intelligence test, intelligence has nothing to do with, whether a person is, dyslexic or not. It's just another critical test, pretty much like the Bentley of intelligence tests, to determine that child's cognitive proficiency. So we take a look at, there's several subtests that make up their full scale IQ, their spatial strengths, their visual motor strengths, their working memory, their processing speed, and all of those scores together make up their full-scale IQ score, which overall tells their cognitive ability. So the child may score in the average range, high average, above average, low average. So that is a very strong indicator as well. Another test that is used, I particularly use this test. I don't know if all schools use it. It's called TIPS, and what that stands for is Test of Information Processing. And the reason that I use that particular test is because when you think of information processing, as a learner, I need to know how I or how my child processes information. How do they process information visually? How do they process information auditorily? Are they a kinesthetic learner? Are they a tactile learner? So that particular test gives me a lot of insight, and that is a part of the battery of assessments when I administer dyslexia testing. Another test, I mentioned the Wyatt, the WIS, the GORT, the TIPS, the CTOP. Another test that I use is the CEL-5. That is the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals. So that test focuses on everything dealing with language, receptive language, expressive language, language context, grammatical structure, syntactic structure, word relationships, word associations, reading, oral reading, silent reading. Just so much information dealing with language, because dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. So the more tests that you have, and I'm not saying to give all the tests in the world, but the more tests that you have that speak to language, it's going to be extremely important. As a matter of fact, when you take a look at my website, I invite you to take a look at my website. I have a specific tab dedicated to dyslexia, and I have a section on there that states what you should be testing for, what an evaluator should be testing for when you're talking about visual processing, auditory processing, on all of those different areas. And I give examples of what that looks like. So that can help you articulate and ask those questions when you're meeting with your child's team. But those are just a few examples of core tests that should be a part of the if we're trying to evaluate a child for dyslexia.
And some of the things I do is, while a psychologist or a primarily a school psychologist is doing assessments, go online and look for a sample report. That sample report is going to show you the tests and the subtests. That'll let you know if the evaluator left out like pseudo, right? Which is very important. And sometimes those tests, those subtests get missed. I don't know why, but they do. So you want to be aware of that. If at all possible. Another question is, I don't understand what words correct per minute plus % of accuracy means. Isn't word correct per minute just the words correct 100% of reading each word?
Can you repeat that question, please? I was typing the website in the
Sure.
chat.
I don't understand what words correct per minute plus % of accuracy means. Isn't words correct per minute just the words correct 100% of the reading each word?
Well, depending on, and I would have to see what the test, because sometimes when they're looking at those scores, sometimes it's the words read correct within 1 minute. Sometimes it's technically the words read per minute is the accuracy of what they're reading, but sometimes those tests have different, I guess, categories or subcategories that are to be looked at or can be looked at. So that is dependent upon what was used in that test. But essentially it is the accuracy of what that child read, how many words they read per minute.
Okay, good. One parent asked, my son has dysgraphia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia diagnosis, but I was told dyslexia is not an appropriate diagnosis as he can read, but you're dyslexic, so forgive me, the DYSEIDETIC, dyslexia was spot on. He cannot spell even simple words, and he is now 15. What should I be working on getting him help?
Wow.
Is he getting intervention now for the dyslexia? And it was dyslexia, dyspraxia, and what was dyscalculia for the issues?
Dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and dysgraphia.
And what is he currently getting support for?
Denise, can you unmute and chat real quick?
Hi.
Hi.
So my son is basically getting support, where he has sentence starters. He has like Docs Plus types things where he's able to, be able to organize for written expression. But they've said, that his encoding, his decoding, his analytical skills are very good. So he actually doesn't have any dyslexia traits. So he's getting help with his written expression, but he can't even type very simple words. And sometimes even when he's given these, very good, programs that have a lot of, of the words, predictive text and things like that, his typing is so off on, even being able to spell these words that they're not even picking up, simple words like, and when I researched it, it was like what and through and, very, very simple words that at 15, he can't even spell.
And then you said your son was formally diagnosed with dyslexia?
Not dyslexia, just dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. Yeah.
I definitely think it's worth him getting, he needs to be evaluated for dyslexia, because what you're describing in the decoding, that's a red flag for it right there. And the fact that he's 15 and hasn't mastered those skill sets yet, he might to do sometimes, but again, those skills go all the way back to early literacy. If he hasn't mastered the skills, he needs a lot of repetition. So when I spoke about the structured language approach, those Orton-Gillingham methods, it really breaks down every unit of sound from phonological awareness to phonics. That is the formation to help support the decoding and the encoding to produce a fluent and efficient speller and reader and writer, essentially.
Wow.
So he's at a private school right now, a very good private school, Woodland, and they do have.
Oh yeah,
They do have Orton-Gillingham, and they do have Wilson Reading,
Yeah,
and this is a private placement because of his old school not being able successful. So I think probably I could talk to them and say, yeah, I would like Connor to be in this Wilson program and things like that. Do you think that would be a helpful strategy for him?
Yes, and the person there, I'm sorry, the person there.
He's in the perfect environment. We know them very well at Woodland. Tell them Dr. Tracy and Dr. Campbell sent you.
Yes.
They have excellent programs, and they have the premier programs at the school. So that will work to his benefit. Absolutely.
Definitely. I was just with the head of schools at I was just with the head of schools from Woodland. We just attend the International Dyslexia Association. In fact, she and I got stuck on a plane together. So she's adamant to help the children. Definitely talk to her. Penny is there. She's actually the Wilson instructor there. She's phenomenal. Please get him the help while he's there. He's in the perfect place. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So who do you suggest I talk to?
You could talk to the teacher that he has now, and she'll direct you to the Wilson person, and they'll get the right assessments and everything, because he's actually in the perfect place. Honestly, he is, because they really do they do it well there. They do it
Okay.
ability there. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And they weren't the ones that assessed him, but I think they are seeing these difficulties that he's having. So yeah. I think I just need to bring it up, because you're right. They are very receptive, but I'd never heard about dyslexia having to do with spelling before, with this how do I say the word, by the way, Dr. Campbell? Dyseidetic?
Dyseidetic, yes. Dyseidetic, dysphonetic, and dysphoneidetic. Dysphoneidetic is simply mixed dyslexia. And I'm putting Penny's contact, her name in the chat for you. Penny Madalski is her name at the Woodland School.
Excellent.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
I said I'm walking away with even some new knowledge myself, which is great. A parent said, our schools removed goals related to reading while our son is receiving Wilson Reading Program. How can we advocate for anything if there isn't any data to support the need? They rely on data that is not accurate, being the grades. And I don't give a whole lot of weight to grades myself. I like to look at the pre-test, if we did the WIST or the WADE, then I also like to look at the post-tests, right, which should be at 90%. What is the rate of acquisition? How many times are we hitting it? Whatever. And are we retaining it? But what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, absolutely. She said that she doesn't have enough data. Is that what the challenge is? Did I hear that correctly?
The school is really
It
relying
sounded like the
on
sound was
data.
breaking up.
The school is relying more on the grades
Oh, okay.
versus
Oh,
the data.
Oh, okay.
and that is a big red flag, and it's a big red problem, a big problem, because it's almost if the school is saying, well, your daughter or your son is not failing enough because their grades, they have a C, they have a D plus, and a D still might be passing, but that is not specific data, as you said, like from a pretest or, specific screening or testing instruments that shows measurements from, benchmark to benchmark or objective to objective or goal to goal. So grades, they're very vague, to be quite honest. We need more reliable data, more specific types of data.
Yeah.
And
so
as
you
the
look-
parent, you can request that.
Oh, absolutely. I always suggest that my parents go back and request years worth of benchmarks. If I have a
Yes.
kid in fifth grade, I want to go back to kindergarten. Show me all the benchmarks from kindergarten. There should be 3 benchmarks per school year. And look at that.
Yes.
We're talking about reading fluency. Sometimes I've seen it where they've lowered the expectation for a student, but if I go on Reading Rockets, I can look at the 50th percentile where the child should be, right? In the spring.
Right.
And you want to make sure that you're getting the child there. Sometimes schools will be like, well, but they're at 50 and you want them at 100. I'm like, well, I guess we have to step it up, right? Because your specific learning disability, if there isn't a cognitive impairment, it's more than 1 year's progress for a child. It should be closing the gap is what we're looking for.
Exactly.
So, another question is, won't ADHD and dyslexia look the same? If you have a combination of ADHD, dyslexia, autism, etc., who do you go to get tested and diagnosed?
Good question. So, and the challenge with that is because number one, not everybody necessarily tests for dyslexia. You have more individuals who can test or screen for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is why, unfortunately, many children get the label or the categorization of ADHD when they truly might be dyslexic. Sometimes autism and ADHD is just the easiest label to put on a child. And I hate to say that, but that is the reality, because I've had parents show me on the documentation and their child was not necessarily autistic. I've had parents tell me that that was the only way that they were able to get services, so the school put that label on there. So we have to be very careful. I always suggest, because I am a practitioner and evaluator who can evaluate and identify and diagnose for dyslexia, I also have screening and testing instruments to identify characteristics of attention deficit disorder. So I have some partnerships with some primary care physicians. However, before I will even test or screen an individual to determine if they truly have attention deficit disorder, I will ensure that that parent provides me with the medical history and medical background from a primary care physician. And after I actually administer my test, I also share those findings with the parent and with the primary care physician together, because it's not one person or one test that can make the diagnosis. You really need to, and especially some children have just challenging profiles. They have a lot of mixed, deficits and a lot of mixed areas that they're really strong in. So you need to have multiple conversations and multiple eyes and multiple levels of expertise when you're looking at any child's profile, especially those challenging profiles where we're not really sure and where certain traits and characteristics mimic one another. Because a child with dyslexia is going to possibly be inattentive and off task and cannot sustain their attention and their level of focus. But of course, that comes with attention deficit as well. So we really have to be careful. With a person who has attention deficit disorder, they may be attentive and can't sustain their attention, but they may not necessarily have accuracy or fluency issues or decoding issues. So there's specific tests that you use to administer to determine if that individual or if that child has dyslexia, where the same thing would be for attention deficit disorder as well. There's a test that I particularly use for attention deficit disorder. It's called the TOVA, and TOVA, TOVA, and that stands for Test of Variables of Attention. And The difference between the test that I use and other practitioners use, number one, you're not necessarily going to find a medical doctor that may use it. If you do, you may, but you may not necessarily find it. It's very rare. And you may not find a school professional, psychologist, neurologist, reading specialist, clinical psychologist who administers it as well. So this is why you have to ask different questions and good questions. And just because they don't administer it, it does not mean that they're doing a poor job. It's just not a part of what they do. It's not a part of their profile. The reason I use it is because it is a performance-based test. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because some of the tests and some of the parent inventories, some of them are simply checklists. So for instance, it will be a checklist stating the child does this sometimes, always, never, all, whatever the responses are. And while that information is very important, that is qualitative information just based off of a checklist, based off of the observations that the teacher has made, that the parent has made. But with the TOVA, this child is tested in real time based on their performance. So they actually have tasks. As an example, for the visual stimuli, they are shown visual stimuli on a computer and they have to respond to the visual stimuli, and based on their responses, their level of accuracy and the formula that goes with that, because it's based in real time, I'm able to sit there and watch them, watch their body language. I've had students start to doze off and fall asleep and trying to take out their phone to text, or their mind is just everywhere else. So that gives me a lot of good insight as I'm watching the screen, as I'm watching them hit the button. There's a practice test that they take right before it. And so they know what the directions are. And because they know the directions are to hit that mouse, that's just because they know the direction. So they're just going to hit the mouse because that's what they're supposed to do. But that doesn't mean that they're supposed to hit the mouse at that particular time. They're only supposed to hit the mouse when the stimuli responds a certain way. And for the auditory piece, there are different sounds that they have to listen to for the stimuli. So because it is a performance-based task, for me, the type of evaluation that I like to pull together and construct and analysis that I use, I like to, even though I still use checklists and I take in checklists and responses from teachers and parents, I still like to use that performance-based task for attention deficit disorder because it provides a more holistic view. And with those results, I encourage the family to share that with the primary care physician or any other specialist, especially on the medical team and the multidisciplinary team at school, to come together with one solid definitive identification or diagnosis of attention deficit disorder.
That is like great information. I almost want to work with you.
Thank you.
In your clinic to learn more.
Oh, we need help. We're getting so many calls. We need funding and help to hire more people.
Oh, I am sure. And I'm sure you guys accept compensatory ed, right?
Yes, we do.
Philadelphia, which is
the majority of our students that come, covers the cost of their evaluation, their, supplemental services, their dyslexia therapy. Absolutely. Even transportation. We have students who get transportation from their school, and the compensatory funding can cover that. It can cover, if they need mental health counseling, speech services, it does a lot. It's a really good support system for parents and families.
Right. So that's great. You guys accept the School District of Philadelphia compensatory ed. We don't have a lot of providers simply because of the slow pay, practically no pay, right?
Yes.
But it's you do. And I know that you also do sliding scale as well, I heard, which is great. But I don't think the ratio is for that, which is wonderful. So parents can reach out to you guys directly for that. One parent said, how can we get their school to use your services? That can be very tough, to do because.
And ideally, especially during the pandemic, it seems like it's been a little bit easier. It seems like they're now like, just go wherever, because they're so overwhelmed, they can't cover everybody. But there is a process that you have to go to. Dr. Johnson, having a brain freeze on her first name right now, but Dr. Johnson is the supervisor. She's over compensatory services at the Philadelphia School District. Ideally, you would simply let the school administrator know at your child's school, and then also contact compensatory services to let them know that you have a provider that you've connected with, whether it's the reading clinic or whether it's the Jane Doe or John Doe reading clinic or provider and let them know that you want to either secure an IEE, an independent education evaluation, or supplemental services, to support your child's needs for instruction. Let them know you have the provider, and basically from there, how our process works, the reading clinic is already in the system. So we simply invoice the school district. Once you've identified to the school and to the district that you want us to be your provider, we take care of all of the invoicing to show that the services are being provided, provide you with the progress reports to show you what's being done with your child, so you have it for documentation. So it is a process, but it is a way to navigate the process where it's not so overwhelming.
And your settlement agreement will actually denote the terms, right? So sometimes they'll put in that you can use it for independent evals. Sometimes they don't put it in where you can use it for independent evals. So you have to kind of look at that specifically. But I will tell you, one of the things that I recommend to my parents is if you're going somewhere and they're using an evidence-based intervention, you want to make sure that they're collecting the data. Why do I say that? Because if I get ample data, like showing that my child is making progress, that's when I get to go to the school and say, hey, my child is receiving Orton, Gillingham, Wilson, Barton, whatever it may be, and they made remarkable progress. And here's the edge. You're not just saying like, hey, I heard about Wilson and I'd like to have you do it. You're actually going, we've had Wilson or Barton or Orton. My child has made significant progress. Here is the data. I am asking you to implement this and start that program. They can't sit there and say no. It's very difficult because you already have the data, right? And that data will support your position to get that program in school. They may still say no, but you might have to, get some help to push a few buttons to get what you need. So yeah, it's all good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Just put on your belt of patience.
It's a belt of patience, and it's knowing how to write emails, right? To the team, outlining your concerns and what you're looking for, right? And you want to be careful. We want to send emails without a doubt, but we don't want to send an abundance of emails, right? Because the abundance of emails can be counterproductive. That will go into the hearing. Well, they'll be like, well, but look at all the emails that we're getting, the parent is interfering, right? So there's the balance to that you have to really kind of watch. I always say, make sure that you put your requests or the points that you're trying to make in bullet format. Why? Because sometimes I find when you send emails to school, their eyes glaze over and they don't get to all your questions. If you put your questions in bullet format, it's kind of hard to miss them, right? It makes it a little bit easier. I can't think of anything else at this time, so I'm going to turn off the recording. Trying to think. Yeah.